Thank you for listening to this download of Start the Week, presented by Anne McElvoy.
Hello, invasions and immigration on the menu this morning of the plant and animal variety as we tangle with Japanese knotweed and other alien arrivals, follow in the traces of woolly mammoths and ponder the fate of our picture book meadows in an era of intensive farming. All of my guests today know a thing or two about the natural world. Monique Simmons is a senior researcher at Kew's Royal Botanic Gardens. John Lewis Stemple has written a book celebrating meadows. And Victoria Herridge is a paleontologist whose claim to fame is having discovered the smallest mammoth. But first, Ken Thompson, author of a new book, Where Do Camels Belong? The Story and Science of Invasive Species. We do have to get an answer to the camel conundrum, Ken. Where do camels belong?
Well, that's a very good question, isn't it? And that's why I chose that for the title for the book. Because our attitude to alien species tends to be driven more by prejudice and misunderstanding than anything else. And one of the things at the root of that is, where do things belong? And camels are just a nice example where that's a difficult question to answer.
You're keeping us guessing.
I am. I'm sorry. I'll cut to the chase. Camels, well, I'll ask you, where do camels belong? I can almost imagine what you're going to say. A picture will come in your mind of a camel with a pyramid in the background because you're thinking of the Middle East or North Africa. In fact, camels evolved at least 40 million years ago in North America, and they migrated relatively recently to Asia and also to South America. Llamas are just camels without humps. And then, relatively recently, in fact, only about 8,000 years ago, all North America's camels went extinct. So now where do you think camels belong? Oh, and bear in mind, just to add to that, the only place you can now find wild dromedaries is Australia.
So you may be testing my camel knowledge, even having read your excellent book, but go on then. So this idea of belonging and the camel is really what's on your mind.
Yes, I think people have this idea. Behind our attitude to alien species is the idea that things have places where they belong and they have other places where they don't belong. But that opinion is very often based on a snapshot of time, which is very, very short indeed, and we don't realise how much things move around and have moved around a huge amount, even in the relatively recent past. And I think we'll hear more about that later this morning on the subject of mammoths.
And the underlying theme of your book, which goes far beyond camels and deals with plants and animals across time, you're very critical of the terms native and alien. And if I said to you, well, OK, you can pick a big bone with me about 500,000 years here or there, but roughly speaking, I know what is native and I know what isn't native to a part of the world. You would still take me on that, would you?
I think I probably would. My impression is that we tend to dislike alien species on principle, although I'm never quite sure what the principle actually is. But we're actually very often not all that clear about what's native and what's alien. I mean, for example, what's your attitude to two very similar British mammals, rabbits and hares? Do you like them? Do you dislike them?
Well, I personally haven't got much of a preference between them, but I can see that the point you're making, that hares get the full-on biodiversity treatment, protected species, and rabbits get shot, put in pies, or culled.
Hares get the full-on treatment, their own biodiversity action plan. Every conservation measure known to man is directed at them. Rabbits are just pestilential. In fact,
it's not just about numbers, then. It's about, you're seeing it about a sort of cultural attitude.
I mean, the point about both of those species is they were both native in a previous interglacial. So if you want to go back far enough, they're British natives. In this interglacial, neither of them is a British native.
Interglacial being
since the last ice age.
Since the
last ice age, neither is native. They're both introduced. Most people don't know or care whether they're introduced, but we know what we like.
And what about plants? Because that's an area where there's a whole argument, and the emotional argument about what we view as alien or invasive and what we think of as native or local does tend to rouse passions. And we'd like to think of snowdrops, of gooseberries as native. We're wrong about that as well.
We're certainly wrong about that. Snowdrops are not native. In fact, snowdrops are a recent garden escape in Britain. Most people think they're native. Gooseberries aren't native. Snake's Head Fritillary, which is one of the great conservation icons of British nature conservation, is a recent garden escape, we now know. So
nothing sacred, isn't it, really?
Nothing sacred.
Monique Simmons, you're at Kew. Is the labelling of plants as arbitrary as Ken seems to suggest there?
Labelling of plants, I mean, the naming of plants is absolutely critical. Of course, nowadays we often, along with the Latin name, knowledge about the locals, often trivial names that we give plants that we use every day. We normally will indicate where the plant came from, which would be more recent. I mean, going back to the collections at Kew, we have records over the last 200 years of where plants are collected, and of course that is often used to indicate modern day native, invasive status. But of course you can go back to samples from the soil, etc., that will show that plants were in places which you now don't find them. But the purpose at Kew is to help look at those plants that are in habitats today that have a kind of a balanced nature, and when something comes in that hasn't got that close, recent link in, that's when you can get problems between plants, one plant invading a territory of another and out-competing it, or in my case, my interest is often insects that can do damage to a plant.
Well, we'll come back to some of your work a little later if we could, but Ken, I'm sure there are lots of nature lovers and gardeners who perhaps don't feel as sanguine about this idea that an invasive species, something like the Japanese knotweed, which I patrolled my garden at the weekend in fear that it was about to take over my tiny little patch, or Rhododendron ponticum, these are not welcome species. They force out other species. We might not easily be able to get rid of them. Is that not a perfectly rational response?
That is a perfectly rational response, but we tend to focus on a very small number of problematic invasives, and I can guarantee that any conversation about alien plants in Britain will turn within the first 30 seconds to a discussion of Japanese knotweed.
And quite right too.
And quite right too, you might say. But how typical is Japanese knotweed? It's very atypical. I mean, how many alien species of plants have escaped into the wild in Britain? Do you know?
No, I don't.
No, you don't know.
Are you going to tell me?
And I'm not going to tell you because no one knows. But it's at least 3,000. Now, how many?
So it's basically Japanese knotweed, and the others have given them a bad rap.
Yeah, I mean, how many of those are like Japanese knotweed?
John's dying to say something.
Because as someone who farms, so who's at the practical end of this, I mean, I think it's actually a great deal of sense in what Ken is saying, you see. Because if you're farming, sometimes the problem is actually the invasiveness of the plant. It's actually immaterial, really, whether it's actually native or alien. And I was looking at the wood behind the house yesterday. It's a 4-acre wood, and the ground is completely covered in bramble, making actually rather uninteresting and unimportant monoculture. But it's a domestic species, I think, and I actually wonder, isn't it actually something that's perhaps a domestic invasive species? I mean, for me, if I spend an hour bashing back native bracken, or I spend an hour digging up introduced rhododendrons, I mean, I'm still spending an hour. The time and the principle are the same. I'm actually trying to protect.
And emotionally,
a kind of
you don't have a response to one over the other.
Sometimes I do have a gut feeling. There's some things that do seem to me, out of place, but that's probably culturally conditioned. So, to me, sometimes really I think the problem is, invasiveness, not the particular species. So my starting point would sometimes be what's the environment we're trying to protect, rather than what we're trying to protect it against.
Victoria Herridge, your mammoths don't get to be invasive these days, sadly, because we have to invade museums to go and have a look at them.
Can only find them in museums now.
How do you respond to this?
Well, I mean, obviously, having a deeper time perspective, you are very aware of things moving around, expanding their ranges, contracting in response to climatic changes, going extinct in places like that. But at the same time, I think what John says is exactly right in some ways. It's about understanding the nature of the characteristics of plants or animals that allow them to spread and to spread rapidly, and then to ask yourselves maybe what problems they're causing. But in some respects, what Ken is saying is on one hand exactly correct, but on the other hand, he's kind of, I feel, sort of confusing his own arguments in a way, because they're talking about us, the world in general, conservationist scientists being slightly prejudiced against invasives. But I think really the focus goes on the invasives that are the problems, and the energy goes on the invasives that are the problems. So in some ways, we're actually, I suppose, people are working at that end of things.
Well, yeah, back to you on that, Ken. And what can we really do about it anyway? Because I got the sense, reading your book and a number of examples that you mentioned, that the attempts to control invasives you thought were somewhat doomed.
That's very much the case. If you look at the literature, most attempts to control or eradicate alien species are doomed from the start. So there's not a great deal we can do about it. I mean, I guess later on we might end up talking to Monique about one or two things that she's concerned about, like oak processionary moth. I mean,
in just a second.
Yes, I mean they've given up on that.
Things like, I just want to press you just slightly on that. Introducing natural predators, all these big campaigns that we've seen, if you follow this subject, they're endless sort of campaigns. Some of them driven by government, some by conservationists. To sort of something can be done or something can be changed. What makes you, give me an example if you could, what makes you so sceptical?
Well, simply an example. There are almost too many examples. I mean, nearly all attempts to control or eradicate alien species across the world, whether we're talking about plants or snakes or beetles or you name it, or toads, they've all failed. I mean, eradication attempts are extremely rarely successful, and when they are successful, tends to be on small islands, where essentially you have a very small area with a defined limit. You know, there's no escape, and you can go in and
calls to
trash
mind
everything.
Sort of Dad's Army view, doesn't it?
Yeah.
You just put up your defences and hope keep the telescope at Dover.
Once a successful species is loose on a large landmass, controlling it is practically impossible.
An ideal moment to bring in Monique Simmons, one of your roles at Kew being to oversee research into the numbers of alien pests and diseases that have settled on our shores. Why is there such an increase, or a perceived increase, Monique?
I think in the last 10 years, especially within UK, there has been an increase in pest, and that really partly reflects, especially plant pests, that partly reflects, I think, the increase in trade in plants. People bringing in seedlings, etc., that have got maybe insects on them or other pests coming in. So it's maybe need to have some form of quarantine. But as Ken has said, sometimes...
I'm just trying to imagine the plant quarantine bit at the big airports, but it's...
Well, at the moment, you see, you're not supposed to bring any soil with plants. You could possibly bring a cut flower, but soil, and of course a lot of pests do come in with soil. So there is the means to do it, and people are very aware of things like the Colorado potato beetle, which is just around the shores.
Isn't that an example of a success story? Ken was just saying there how hard it was to control invasive species, but is that controlled only because we're an island, or because we've got something else right?
I should think it's an island, but also people's awareness of the beetle. So, signs are still around at ports, etc., and so on. So
and it is helpfully distinctive, isn't it? Those scary signs, usually blown up about 300-fold at airports. So you can probably not going to give one as a present to your 7-year-old. But you've been looking, I know, at the oak pro moth.
The oak processionary moth.
Processionary moth. Tell us about the processionary moth.
Well, the oak processionary moth is kind of new to Britain in the form that it's come in since about 2008. There were adults that had been found in traps of the moth beforehand, but it was then found in parts of kind of the London area. It attacks oak trees. And it can, when it's in a high abundance, cause problems to the oak. But the main reason for having concern here is the human effect. The small little larvae, as they grow up, have small little hairs, and they can cause an adverse response, not only to humans but also to animals. So here we're trying to control them.
Other adverse response, as in irritation,
Irritation,
breathing.
skin, eyes, and therefore respiratory, because if you breathe them in, they will affect your...
So they're far worse for humans than they are for
Yes,
tree, other than in huge
Yes, and
amounts.
where they occur in parts of, say, Austria and parts of Germany, you can have parks closed at times when they are at this larval stage. So there's an opportunity in Britain of seeing if they could get rid of them before they really established. So this is coming in with a form of control early on.
Ken, will nature eventually work out a way to deal with this sort of foreign predator, this unwelcome oak-dwelling creature?
All the evidence suggests that alien species, once they become established in new habitats, they eventually acquire new predators and new parasites, and therefore their abundance ultimately declines.
It's the word ultimately that might be worrying us.
Well, ultimately, again, is because we tend to think of these things on a kind of cycle of not even human lifetimes, much less than that, electoral sort of lifetimes. I mean, very short spaces of time. So, in other words, if something looks like it's a success, we panic. But can I tell you? Can I tell you a nice?
Take the long view.
Can I tell you? You mentioned quarantine earlier.
Yes.
Can I tell you a nice quarantine story, which is 2011? 2011, Kirsten Bosch had this nice exhibit at Kew, and when they'd finished, they left. They donated all their plants to the RHS. The RHS put them all in their quarantine glasshouse at Wisley, and 2 months later, they were just full of holes and crawling with all kinds of stuff, which no one had noticed. These plants had been assessed by a DEFRA inspector. The RHS had gone over them. Nothing. No one saw them. And yet there was all kinds of stuff on them. Half a dozen pests. Very, very hard to spot these things, given there's £1 billion worth of stuff comes in
Secret
every
agents burrowing their way through defences. Victoria Herod, you do a lot of work on islands, mammoths and islands going together like, I don't know what, mammoths and islands, but that's a particularly interesting habitat, isn't it, in the sense that you have more control over the environment, or at least you think you have.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. As Monique said, one of the interesting things about Britain is it's an island, which makes it easier in some ways to control the borders of it. But we're not an island in terms of humans moving in and out. I mean, the flow of humanity from Britain to around the world for the last 400 years has been incredibly high. So in that sense, we've almost lost our island nature for a long time ago, because if humans are the main body of transportation for organisms, for animals and plants, then we're kind of less islandy than we were. From the mammoth point of view, and fossil elephants in general, they're really good at getting to places. They're good dispersers. And so elephants, which include mammoths, get all over the place. They evolved originally in Africa, but they spread almost everywhere in the world. I mean, they got everywhere apart from Australia and Antarctica. And
anyone who's read Barber won't be in the least surprised.
Exactly. And they're great swimmers. So they can swim to islands, and when they got to islands, usually, I mean, they're not so great they can get to anywhere, but when the sea levels were lower, say during an ice age in the past, and elephants were able to reach islands that were otherwise inaccessible, either via land bridges or because that distance was just that much shorter, they would get there, and then when the sea levels rose again, because these ice ages would alternate between ice age, warmer stage, ice age, warmer stage, sea levels would rise, they got isolated there, and then always evolved to become smaller. So you'd get islands in the Mediterranean like Sicily, Malta, Cyprus,
And this
Crete.
is this idea of dwarfism.
Yeah, they became
Dwarfism in islands, which I know
dwarf elephants and dwarf
know a bit
mammoths.
about, having read some of your work on it. So islands tend to make species get smaller because
They make elephants get smaller, but they make things like rats get bigger. So big things evolve to become smaller, and small things, mammals, evolve to become larger. And it's probably the same reasons in both senses. It's to do with the island environment. And islands are special. There's this theory called the theory of island biogeography. Everything on an island has to get there. And so that barrier means that there are fewer species overall, so fewer predators, fewer competitors, and often less food.
Monique, do plants have a variation on this dwarfism? Do they expand and contract depending on their environment?
They very much evolve with their environment, yes, and some issues you could say with islands and with mountains, that if there are competition in some way, they've got nowhere basically to go unless they're carried from one country to another by birds, etc., or by man. That's one of the concerns that we have in changing habitats at the moment, and potential changes in climate. Where do some of these plants go to if they're actually on the brink, unless they're able to evolve quickly?
So something like the Chelsea Flower Show, which is a great kind of panopticon of foreign plants. I mean, it's very much, the appeal of it is going to see plant species and flowers that one wouldn't otherwise be able to see.
Yeah, Chelsea, again, the history of Kew. People really visited Kew to be able to see this rich diversity of plants, in what was then, you said that, the empire. And of course, our role at that stage was to take plants from one country to another to look for their economic value. So sometimes I'm sure, there could have been some other, alien bodies associated. Well, they wouldn't have been alien. They would have been associated with those plants. And in their natural environment, you would have, as Ken was saying, you most likely would have this control factor. You take something from one environment to another, and maybe it's aggressive, can grow and outcompete other plants, but it doesn't, and it's got, say, an insect on it, or maybe a fungal pathogen. There's nothing to control that insect or that pathogen. That's when you can get some of the issues, and that's where we're having issues at the moment.
The ups and downs of plant globalisation.
Yeah.
But the other side of your work is looking at the untapped properties of plants and using plants in medicinal treatments. We get rather interested in sort of faintly exotic sounding cures or supplements that come from a long way away. Do we neglect perhaps what's closer to home?
Gosh, yes, we have. I mean, my career has really been looking at everybody else's back garden with regard to plants other than our own. It was only actually really when the Millennium Seed Bank started its project at Kew, when we had an opportunity to study UK plants, and that's when we started to look at the medicinal properties of the plants that we have. And of course, plants do vary in their medicinal properties depending on where they are growing, because some of the compounds in plants that have their medicinal properties have a different role in the plant, and it could be that they're defence compounds in the plant, and they'll be expressed in higher amounts if they're actually having to compete under stress.
But do we know more about this because of the kind of work that you are doing and others in the field, or do we know less because there's a bit of a traditional decline in knowledge about plants?
There's a huge decline in, loss, you could say.
Oh, loss, yes.
Especially in UK, about the traditional uses of plants. And there's one project that we're involved in called Remembered Remedies, or Ethnomedica, that is helping to collect the folklore of plants prior to the development of the National Health Service in 1948.
John Lewis Stemple, I wonder how many species of medicinal native plants you find in your meadow. You've written about a year in the life of a meadow where you farm. But I mean, your primary objective isn't really to catalogue types of species or plant. It's more of a love letter, isn't it, to the countryside and to the meadow in particular?
I'm a peasant farmer who decided to channel his inner John Clare and try and capture as best as I could the life, plant life, bird life, insect life, wildlife of one of the last remaining hay meadows in Britain, one which is traditionally maintained, because about 97% of our hay meadows have actually gone in the last 50, 60 years. So I wanted to do that as a kind of observer, and I also wanted to do something else, because hay meadows aren't a natural phenomenon. They're man-made, hacked from the wildwood and maintained by humans in alliance with domestic livestock. So humans are the centre of the story. So I also wanted to say, how I maintain a traditional hayfield, how it's done. It ended up being a bit more authentic than I actually intended, because normally I'd do the taking of the hay with a tractor, and a tractor mower broke down, so I actually ended up doing it scything 5 acres with a Grim Reaper scythe, making it in a very, very traditional way indeed.
It sounds like immensely hard work, and yet you say happiness. The happy man is someone who has finished bringing his hay in, which it connects us to all sorts of poetic tradition. But is it really true that this happiness that you feel in the meadow is of a different quality that someone else might get from a different life?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the story of modern farming is that farmers have become more and more diverse. Have lost their connection with the land, have become very, very separated from it. Because, as farmer, I spend a great deal of my time actually inside a tractor, hermetically sealed. There's a computer which tells me what to do. The aircon's on, the radio's on. I can actually do a field, ever getting into a field.
Or you might as well be in a radio studio.
Precisely. So I decided I actually wanted to go back to a more traditional kind of type of farming, whereas more in touch with the seasons, more in touch with the land.
Did you take the doors off your tractor?
Yeah, I mean, I did. I mean, I de-pimped my tractor, so I could experience the weather in the way that my grandfather used to. Is it important? Yes, it is important, because if you're... The thing about scything by hand, I mean, I would do it again, but not on such a great scale, because it was heaven and it was hell, because the work was backbreaking. But yes, I was much closer to the fields than I'd ever been before, because it was actually so intimately involved with every single living organism actually in it. And it was fantastically meditative. It was a skill that I'd kind of forgotten, but I relearned. But there's a famous Chinese saying from a famous piece of antique Chinese poetry. If you want to know what wisdom is, ask the fellow who cut the hay. Because you kind of get into Zen-like state where you do reflect. You become very, very philosophical indeed. So I think that's probably my brightest ever, which is probably not a very high standard, I grant you, but probably my brightest ever when I was scything away in my field.
This is I've described it as a love letter, but I think it is merited, isn't it? There's a lovely passage, many lovely passages in the book, but at the beginning where you say your heart bumps in admiration when you see a bird rise in flight. There's a very funny bit about the cows go a bit sort of bonkers, don't they, in the springtime and start digging up or dancing, or digging up bits of the grass in a dancing mood. And it seems to me that you're celebrating very particular moments, but you also feel that they're in some way under threat.
Yes, I mean, I think much of the British countryside is under threat. In terms of farmland birds, I think in just the quantity of farmland birds, I think in the last 50 years we've lost actually 50% of the birds. I mean, and birds give us, the soundtrack of our seasons. And we're losing it. The soundtrack of spring, for me, is a skylark singing, it's a cuckoo arriving, and in vast parts of Britain now, you don't get those anymore. And for me, personally, a spring without birdsong, without skylark song, without cuckoo song is no spring at all, frankly.
It sounds idyllic, but if someone says to you that this world that you celebrate was also, for most people who had no other option, you said at one point you actually curse electric light, but for most people living in the countryside for centuries, making farming easier and the kind of progress that in some ways destroys is also the thing that made so many lives easier. Yeah,
my family farmed in Herefordshire for 900 years. So we, have a knowledge of what the hardships of farming, what they involve. Farming is a very tough job. I'm probably the only person around the table who's actually been hospitalised because of their occupation. Is it important to keep tranquil? No, right, no, Monique's been as well. Okay, no, right, it's a comment thing. It is important that we keep it's important that we keep parts of Britain unspoiled, okay? Because, people from the city, for instance, they come out and enjoy it too. It's not just the people who actually live there who enjoy it. I mean, there are all sorts of reasons to keep, parts of Britain beautiful.
Victoria, please tell me you haven't been hospitalised because of mammoths. But
not for a long period of time, anyway. I just wanted to respond to what John was saying there. And of course, I mean, you go to the English countryside and you think, oh, it's lovely and it's wonderful, but it is based on our current baseline of what is our countryside, and therefore what we sort of see and value, which is an interesting conversation to have. It's about what we value and what we want to keep on seeing. But those shifting baselines, they shift very quickly. I mean, even within a generation, the sound of what we think of as the sound of the seasons that John maybe thinks of is different to what, say, my younger sister would think.
I'm pleased you mentioned the seasons, because I was struck by that. I mean, your book follows, in a way, the old countryman's year, that you take us month to month, and yet you do say that seasons always suggest that seasons may be beginning to blur and merge, and that there's a lot of talk about unseasonable weather patterns. And have you noticed that collapsing of the seasons?
I don't think the seasons have ever been quite as sharply demarcated from each other as our categorisation of spring, summer, autumn, winter would suggest. On the ground, I would say that the seasons are wetter than they used to be. I mean, there seems to be a lot more rain than there used to be, not just marked by the excess flooding that we see. It just seems wetter. And that's
more changeable? One of the suggestions is that the seasons are more changeable.
I don't know about that. I certainly would say they are wetter.
Ken?
I read John's book and I very much enjoyed it, and I think it's an absolutely inspiring and beautiful description of of the wildlife on his farm. And I'd recommend anyone to read it. But I wouldn't like anyone who read it to go away with the idea that the only place you're going to see wildlife in Britain is if you go and hide in a hedge in a farm in darkest Herefordshire. When I'm not winding people up about invasive species, one of my main passions in life is wildlife gardening, and there's a remarkable quantity of wildlife lurking in your own garden, quite honestly, if you just look for it.
Yeah, we should be a bit more curious, even if we don't have the acres and the hedgerows.
Oh, absolutely. You'd be amazed what there is just outside your back door.
John?
I agree absolutely with Ken here, actually, because in fact, I think one of the things I think is most encouraging is the fact there are all these projects in inner cities, River of Flowers, for instance, and Kew's doing something, isn't it, about creating wildflower meadows, in people's gardens, in public spaces, in cities. I mean, I think we should have more of what I like, more, around Britain. Let's sort of go for it.
I have a fantastic one near me. Just goes round the edge of a pretty ugly housing block in the inner city, and it just lifts the heart, doesn't it?
It can be done anywhere.
Pass something like that.
Yeah,
Yes, one of the projects at Kew is to help collect seeds from UK native species, but those from different habitats, so you can actually introduce the plants back to the habitats that they come from. And you see these wild meadow packs, and care must be taken actually that they do contain what we think of as UK species at the moment.
John, do you feel yourself to be motivated by maintaining native species as such, or is a practically adapted farmer for a mere 900 years? Does Ken's argument that we're perhaps making too much of a fuss about it also sort of linger in your mind?
Well, I mean, as I said earlier on, I tend to agree with Ken in quite a lot of, that the sort of distinctions between native and alien aren't really very meaningful. I mean, I think part of the problem for me is just that farming life itself is actually declining as well in terms of how the countryside is. It's just changing so rapidly now.
Well, I suppose if you were a paleontologist, John, you might be able to imagine mammoths trampling across your meadow. How welcome they would be right now, I don't know, but they were once very plentiful in Europe, a native species no less, and the Natural History Museum is having its big mammoth festival with an exhibition this month. Not only the best preserved remains of a baby woolly mammoth known as Luba, but Victoria Herich as the great expert on mammoths' bones from the smallest mammoth, which I think is your claim to fame in the mammoth world.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, this is the remains of a mammoth that was actually discovered on Crete, and it was discovered by an incredible pioneering paleontologist from the early 20th century called Dorothea Bates. But when she discovered it, she didn't realise, well, she had an inkling, but she didn't really realise it was a mammoth. She thought it was a dwarf straight-tusked elephant, a different kind of elephant altogether. But when we looked at it 100 years later, me and my boss, Adrian Lister, we looked at this tooth that was in the Natural History Museum collections, and all the features about it screamed mammoth at us. And not woolly mammoth, a mammoth that was actually a much older mammoth, one of the first mammoths that arrived in Europe, probably the southern mammoth, which got to Europe about 3.5 million years ago. And so we saw this, we thought, wow, no, it's a mammoth for sure. And then we decided to go back and see if we could find the place where Dorothea Bates found those fossils, because they're in the museum collections, but where did they come from? Unfortunately, we have her diaries and the map she took with her to Crete in 1904, and so we were able to use those, and I could follow literally in her footsteps and locate this place where the fossils were. It took a while because we heard books are her notebooks are great. I mean, she can describe what monastery she went to, 1 monastery, 2 monastery, gorge, see, turn right, walk for a bit, and you can do that, and sure enough, you find it. But
and eventually you find the tiny Christian mammoth. But what can you learn from these very small mammoths? I suppose the popular imagination is always conquered by the big things. What are the little ones? Let us in on.
Well, that's just it, isn't it? It sort of turns it's always an oxymoron to have a dwarf mammoth, and so it is an oxymoron. But it's the idea that everything we understand about big animals, particularly big mammals in the current world, is based on elephants, because elephants are the largest living land mammal. Some of the key questions we need to ask ourselves is, what is it about an elephant that it is because it's big, and what is it about an elephant that is there because it's an elephant? And looking at these dwarf versions of they're very, very close relatives, is a really interesting way into that. And on top of that, what's really nice about these dwarf elephants and mammoths is there are so many of them. They evolve so many times independently on so many islands. They create a really nice kind of natural experiment in understanding how evolution works.
For those of us who might be a bit insecure about how big a small mammoth is, give us an idea.
Well, this mammal from Crete was just over a metre tall as an adult, which is about the same size as a baby elephant. So that's as an adult, and then of course its babies would have been much smaller than that.
There is great excitement about another baby mammoth who died sadly young, 42,000 years ago or so, and that's Luba, the baby mammoth who has been extremely well preserved and is about to make a guest appearance at the Natural History Museum. Tell us about Luba.
Oh, Luba. Oh, it's an amazing story. She was found on the side of a riverbank by a reindeer herder's son, and it is in
Russia.
Siberia. Yeah, in Siberia. Now, the permafrost in Siberia erodes really rapidly every summer. Big chunks of it wash away when the rivers come past as the permafrost melts, and the actual number of mammoth carcasses that are found there seems to be increasing, partly maybe because the permafrost is melting more quickly as the climate changes, but also because there's a kind of a concerted effort to go and look for them, hunting for mammoth ivory and things like that, which has a big commercial value. But Yuba is, well, she's just beautiful. I mean, I've only seen pictures. They're unwrapping her today, and I'm not there because I'm here, but the pictures of her are just quite extraordinary. She is the best, most complete permafrost mammoth ever found. Now, I work on fossils, so it's very rare to actually, for any paleontologist, to have the chance to see their animal actually in the flesh. We usually have to imagine that, the flesh around the bones. When you actually have a chance to see an extinct animal there with its, its skin, some of its hair, some of her hairs, most of it's gone, sadly. Her eyelashes. Her trunk. I mean, the trunk wasn't fossilised. We have to infer the presence of trunks from fossil elephants based on their skull structure. And it's just... it's just extraordinary. The pictures are extraordinary enough, so the chance to actually see her is it's a chance of a lifetime.
We know a lot about her in terms of what her last meal, the remnants of her last meal in her stomach. And obviously there's a fascination with it. There's a sense almost of time travel. Mm-hmm. What else would we learn from that extraordinary event as a paleontologist, or indeed as any scientist in this field, when you're able to bring up a find like this?
Yeah, well, you get her life story, which is really nice for starters, but then you can broaden that out because you start to get insights into things that we think we knew about mammoths, about their social structure, about their anatomy, that we've inferred from comparisons with living elephants that we actually could see confirmed when looking at Luba. So, for example, we assume that the social groupings of mammoths was very similar to their closest relatives, the Asian elephants. But then when we saw Luba and she was autopsied, she firstly had mother's milk in her gut, but also fecal matter. So we could tell that Luba had been eating probably her mother's poo, which sounds a bit disgusting.
Which is just something that mammoths did, huh?
Well, and elephants do it as well.
Yeah,
I mean, quite regularly. It's quite baby elephants, when they're born, their teeth are not so great, but
They should look after them then, shouldn't they? We've talked a lot about native and alien species today. Mammoths were native once. If we could reintroduce them, would we? Should we?
Would we? Should we? They're two different things. I would say we shouldn't, but that's mostly from an ethical point of view, having to use Asian elephants to bring them back. Interestingly, the last mammoth in the UK from 14,000 years ago was not so far from John. It was in Shropshire, in a place called Condover. So it's not hard to imagine an elephant of some kind roaming around that area, but I'd advise not.
John Lewis Semple, would you have him back near tramping around Herefordshire?
Possibly not, but there is actually a serious attempt at the moment to bring back an animal contemporaneous with the mammoth, which is the auroch, which is the ancient prehistoric breed of cattle which died out. And I think it's about 6 foot high at the shoulder, 1 ton, and through a process of backbreeding, that people are now trying to bring that back. I don't think I'm going to volunteer to do the milking of an animal that's 6 foot high at the shoulder and is tetchy.
Having read your descriptions of how difficult it is to shear a lot of sheep, the idea of milking a mammoth would be a step too far. Ken Thompson, would you be in favour of reintroducing a mammoth?
Well, I think elephants and mammoths are just another nice illustration of how short-term our view of the world normally is, and how the relatively recent past was so different, because we live in this present interglacial, of course. The previous interglacial was very different in Britain. The previous interglacial had the large, straight-tusked forest elephant, which was not closely related to Victoria's mammoth. And therefore, it would have been, if there'd been people around then, it would have been a very, very different place indeed, because ecosystems that are run by elephants are very different ecosystems than the ones that we have today. So the present interglacial, for example, before we came along, was basically covered with trees. The previous one was much more open, because there's nothing better at killing trees than elephants.
Monique, do you warm to the idea of bringing back extinct species, and also the potential there of DNA?
Bringing them back,
how far would you go with your
but
plants?
then you've got to make sure that you've got the ecosystems to be able to support them, and the plants, the suitable plants, the grasses, etc., that you'd need. And I think that would be the challenge. I mean, we need, within UK at the moment, we have a very man-made environment.
I actually suspect that an elephant would do fine on the plant point of view, but we haven't got any large predators to keep them in check. And one of the key things when you look at elephant park management in places like South Africa is how do you manage too large a herd of elephants, because as Ken says, they create a very, very, very large impact on the environment. And so if you want to have elephants back in Wales or Scotland or somewhere, then you need to have lions as well. And then we start to get into a whole other interesting discussion altogether. But, you know, it's one worth having, but it's about, I think it really is, all of these things come down to what we value, because what is natural? Where do you draw that idea of what is it somewhere with no humans in it?
I think there's
know.
also the other reason for the fascination, besides the sort of what if, is that you can find mammoth remains in the most extraordinary places, under Trafalgar Square.
Yeah. We have hippo fossils from Trafalgar Square. We have, if you go down the A13, I'm from near Southend in Essex, so driving home, almost every exit you go along to me now screams elephant locality, Avery elephant, Ilford mammoth. You know, you're sort of seeing these sites, and it's just lots and lots of extraordinary animals that are found all there along the Thames terraces.
If they knew where they were heading. Well, there we must leave our pondering about natural matters. Thanks to all my guests, Monique Simmons and Victoria Herridge. You can see Luba the baby, woolly mammoth, at the Natural History Museum's Mammoth exhibition from this Friday. And there's also a display of medicinal plants at Kew Gardens. Ken Thompson's Where Do Camels Belong? The Story and Science of Invasive Species, and John Lewis Stemple's Meadowlands are both out now. Next week we have a special edition of Start the Week recorded at the Charleston Literary Festival, and you can hear Tom Sutcliffe talking to the novelists Tim Winton, Karl Ove Knausgaard and Nicola Barker. But from now, thank you and naturally goodbye.
There's more information about Start the Week on the programme's website. Go to bbc.co.uk, where you'll also find many more Radio 4 programmes you can download for free.
In fear that it was about to take over my tiny little patch, or Rhododendron ponticum. These are not welcome species. They force out other species. We might not easily be able to get rid of them. Is that not a perfectly rational response?
That is a perfectly rational response, but we tend to focus on a very small number of problematic invasives, and I can guarantee that any conversation about alien plants in Britain will turn within the first 30 seconds to a discussion of Japanese knotweed.
And quite right too.
And quite right too, you might say. But how typical is Japanese knotweed? It's very atypical. I mean, how many alien species of plants have escaped into the wild in Britain? Do you know?
No, I don't.
No, you don't know.
Are you going to tell me?
And I'm not going to tell you because no one knows. But it's at least 3,000. Now, how many of them?
It's basically Japanese knotweed, and the others have given them a bad rap.
Yeah, I mean, how many of those are like Japanese knotweed?
John's dying to say something.
Because as someone who farms, so who's at the practical end of this, I mean, I think it's actually a great deal of sense in what Ken is saying, you see. Because if you're farming, sometimes the problem is actually the invasiveness of the plant. It's actually immaterial, really, whether it's actually native or alien. And I was looking at the wood behind the house yesterday. It's a 4-acre wood, and the ground is completely covered in bramble, making actually rather uninteresting and unimportant monoculture. But it's a domestic species, I think, and I actually wonder, isn't it actually something that's perhaps a domestic invasive species?
And then relatively recently, in fact, only about 8,000 years ago, all North America's camels went extinct. So Now where do you think camels belong? Oh, and bear in mind, just to add to that, the only place you can now find wild dromedaries is Australia.
So you may be testing my camel knowledge, even having read your excellent book. But go on then. So this idea of belonging and the camel is really what's on your mind.
Yes, I think people have this idea. Behind our attitude to alien species is the idea that things have places where they belong and they have other places where they don't belong. But that opinion is very often based on a snapshot of time, which is very, very short indeed, and we don't realise how much things move around and have moved around a huge amount, even in the relatively recent past. And I think we'll hear more about that later this morning on the subject of mammoths.
And the underlying theme of your book, which goes far beyond camels and deals with plants and animals across time, is you're very critical of the terms native and alien. And if I said to you, well, OK, you can pick a big bone with me about 500,000 years here or there, but roughly speaking, I know what is native and I know what isn't native to a part of the world. You would still take me on that, would you?
I think I probably would. My impression is that we tend to dislike alien species on principle, although I'm never quite sure what the principle actually is. But we're actually very often not all that clear about what's native and what's alien. I mean, for example, what's your attitude to two very similar British mammals, rabbits and hares? Do you like them? Do you dislike them?
Well, I personally haven't got much of a preference between them, but I can see that the point you're making, that hares get the full-on biodiversity treatment, protected species, and rabbits get shot put in pies or culled.
Hares get the full-on treatment, their own biodiversity action plan. Every conservation measure known to man is directed at them. Rabbits are just pestilential. In fact,
it's not just about numbers, then. It's about, you're seeing it about a sort of cultural attitude.
I mean, the point about both of those species is they were both native in a previous interglacial. So if you want to go back far enough, they're British natives. In this interglacial, neither of them is a British native.
Interglacial being
since the last ice age.
Since the last
ice age, neither is native. They're both introduced. Most people don't know or care whether they're introduced, but we know what we like.
And what about plants? Because that's an area where there's a whole argument, and the emotional argument about what we view as alien or invasive and what we think of as native or local does tend to rouse passions. And we'd like to think of snowdrops, of gooseberries as native. We're wrong about that as well.
We're certainly wrong about that. Snowdrops are not native. In fact, snowdrops are a recent garden escape in Britain. Most people think they're native. Gooseberries aren't native. Snake's Head fritillary, which is one of the great conservation icons of British nature conservation, is a recent garden escape, we now know.
Thank you for listening to this download of Start the Week, presented by Anne McElvoy.
Hello. Invasions and immigration on the menu this morning of the plant and animal variety as we tangle with Japanese knotweed and other alien arrivals, follow in the traces of woolly mammoths and ponder the fate of our picture book meadows in an era of intensive farming. All of my guests today know a thing or two about the natural world. Monique Simmons is a senior researcher at Kew's Royal Botanic Gardens. John Lewis Stemple has written a book celebrating meadows. And Victoria Herridge is a paleontologist whose claim to fame is having discovered the smallest mammoth. But first, Ken Thompson, author of a new book, Where Do Camels Belong? The Story and Science of Invasive Species. We do have to get an answer to the camel conundrum, Ken. Where do camels belong?
Well, that's a very good question, isn't it? And that's why I chose that for the title for the book. Because our attitude to alien species tends to be driven more by prejudice and misunderstanding than anything else. And one of the things at the root of that is, where do things belong? And camels are just a nice example where that's a difficult question to answer.
You're keeping us guessing.
I am. I'm sorry. I'll cut to the chase. Camels, well, I'll ask you, where do camels belong? I can almost imagine what you're going to say. A picture will come in your mind of a camel with a pyramid in the background because you're thinking of the Middle East or North Africa. In fact, camels evolved at least 40 million years ago in North America, and they migrated relatively recently to Asia and also to South America. Llamas are just camels without hump. So
nothing's sacred, isn't it, really?
Nothing's sacred.
Monique Simmons, you're at Kew. Is the labelling of plants as arbitrary as Ken seems to suggest there?
Labelling of plants, I mean, the naming of plants is absolutely critical. Of course, nowadays we often, with along with the Latin name, knowledge about the locals, often trivial names that give plants that we use every day. We normally will indicate where the plant came from, which would be more recent. I mean, going back to the collections at Kew, we have records over the last 200 years of where plants are collected, and of course that is often used to indicate modern day native, invasive status. But of course you can go back to samples from the soil, etc., that will show that plants were in places which you now don't find them. But the purpose at Kew is to help look at those plants that are in habitats today that have a kind of a balanced nature, and when something comes in that hasn't got that close, recent link in, that's where you can get problems between plants, one plant invading territory of another and out competing it, or in my case, my interest is often insects that can do damage to a plant.
Well, we'll come back to some of your work a little later if we could, but Ken, I'm sure there are lots of nature lovers and gardeners who perhaps don't feel as sanguine about this idea that an invasive species, something like the Japanese knotweed, which I patrolled my garden at the weekend in